The Stormweaver is a powerful class, capable of nuking enemies and bosses out of orbit before they even have a chance to move.
I'm in danger!
In this deep dive, we'll talk about all of the skills alongside recommended supports and resource priorities, burst rotations and different playstyles, the passive tree, and optimizing jewels and gear for maximum damage. Let's get into it. First, let's get some basic terminology out of the way. Shock is the main element we'll be building around. This is a debuff that amplifies enemy damage taken. The default value is 20%, and the maximum is 100. With the Strike Twice node in our Ascendancy tree, we can apply a second layer of it, doubling the effect. Lightning Exposure is a debuff that reduces enemy lightning resistance, amplifying damage dealt. This also starts at 20%, but the Scouring Winds node in our Ascendancy increases this by a further 20%. Electrocute is a CC debuff that stuns the enemy when stacked up. We don't use this in our build. Now let's talk about skills. The basic idea is that we want to load up DPS related supports on our high value skills, and relegate one skill as our shock support, which we'll be piling on both shock magnitude and exposure supports onto. Spark launches a spray of projectiles that bounce off walls. This is our primary AoE tool, and also our primary DPS spell in the early game. The core supports are Pierce and Inspiration, but DPS related supports such as Execute and Arcane Temple can be prioritized over Inspiration early on. Flame Wall creates a wall of fire that ignites projectiles that go through it. This adds nearly 50% more base damage to Spark, which is amazing in the early game, but this is fire damage that will not be scaling into the later game as we build more lightning damage. Orb of Storms makes an orb that fires chaining lightning at enemies, with an additional proc for each skill you cast in its radius. This is a powerful DPS addition to our kit, and a convenient source to put debuff related supports on. This is also the only skill we could put Fawn of Mana on. When using this as a shock support, you will want Lightning Exposure, Strip Away, Overcharge, and Conduction. Otherwise, Expense is a good general option for more quality of life. Arc fires chain lightning between enemies, dealing more damage per unused chain. Compared to Spark, Arc can attack over low walls, and is better versus elites and bosses, as well as lower density packs of mobs. Because you won't really have many situations where you need to cast Spark at maximum speed compared to Arc late game, it's preferred to have Arcane Tempo here. Options for remaining slots include Rising Tempest, Mobility, Mana Flare, or any other DPS related support that isn't on Lightning Conduit. Conductivity curses enemies in an area, lowering lightning resistance. This stacks with Exposure, and helps to pump up our burst damage even more. For supports, Heightened Cursed and Cursed Ground are mandatory. The latter effectively doubles the duration of the curse, while also allowing you to precast due to the lingering AoE. Burning Inscription is a 0 mana cost option to get a little bit of extra damage in. Mana Tempest creates an AoE that empowers our mana casting spells to have additional chains, forking projectiles, and extra lightning damage gain. This is extremely powerful, but drains mana per second, increasing based on the mana spent inside of it, making the cost scale exponentially. This is a huge steroid early game, but relatively less important late game, due to Archmage watering down the damage gain significantly. However, it's still a large buff and important to our burst. Premeditation is recommended due to the damage increase, and while Inspiration sounds nice on paper, it's better to put it on your main DPS spell, Arc or Spark. as this reduces the rate at which Tempest's costs ramp up in the first place. Life Tap is a powerful but dangerous option. By changing the cost to health instead of mana, this changes the exponential cost to a linear one, but can leave you very vulnerable. Make sure you know what you're doing. Lightning Warp teleports you to a target under the cooling threshold, instantly killing it and dealing AoE damage, while leaving behind Shocking Ground for 10 seconds. It can also be cast on Ball Lightning. This is a powerful mobility spell that can get you out of a pinch, but more importantly, this Shocked Ground can consistently apply shock to targets standing on it, making this a very powerful debuffing tool when used in conjunction with Ball Lightning. If using this as your shock support, take Lightning Exposure, Strip Away, and Overcharge. Persistence is optional here, and will increase the duration of the Shocked Ground. Generalist options include Soul Drain, Life Drain, and Unleash. Ball Lightning fires a slow-moving projectile that repeatedly shoots bolts of lightning at nearby enemies. This deals a very low amount of damage, but compensates with a bonus 750% chance to shock. When used in conjunction with Lightning Warp, it's recommended to put Unleash here, as you will need to Lightning Warp to 2 separate Ball Lightnings to layer 2 separate stacks of shock. A single Shocked Ground cannot apply 2 layers of shock. Last but certainly not least is Lightning Conduit, our signature nuke. This deals 100% more damage per 5% shock on the enemy, meaning it deals 5 times damage when a default shock is applied. But if we stack shock magnitude, we could scale this to do over 40 times damage, on top of the inherent damage amp from shock. Because of how powerful this is, it's recommended to put all the best damage supports here. Consider casting Lightning Mastery, Rising Tempest, Super Critical, and Elemental Focus. Yes, Lightning Conduit still can reapply chokes even with Elemental Focus, so it's a powerful 25% multiplier for free. In setups where you can only get 1 stack, Rising Tempest can be substituted for Inevitable Critical. For Spirit Gems, Mana Remnants is a decent first pickup to get some extra mana, but should be replaced later on with Archmage and or cast on Chalk. Archmage is the keystone of this build, granting bonus lightning damage based on maximum mana at the cost of spending a % of mana per skill cast. This is the primary reason we'll be prioritizing mana and mana regen in our build. First of hearts, you put in anything your open spirit will allow. Clarity, Cannibalism, and Herbalism are nice passives, in that order of priority. So, how does it all come together? What skill should we use to shock, and how do we play around it? We'll cover it in the next section, playstyles and rotations. There are several ways to play a Lightning Stormweaver effectively, and it all revolves around which skill you use as a shock support. I'll go over 3 different options and talk about their pros and cons. Note that these are just generic recommendations. Playstyles can be mixed and matched as needed. The first playstyle revolves around spamming Conduit, taking advantage of the repeated shock application of Shocked Ground from Lightning Warp. This negates the need for any shock champs and has extremely high DPS potential. Run your debuffing supports on Lightning Warp, Overcharge, Lightning Exposure, and Strip Away. The base rotation is as follows. Start out with Sigil of Power, and then use Ball Lightning, teleporting to 2 balls to create 2 Shocked Grounds. Place Conductivity, Orb of Storms, Mana Tempest, and then Conduit and Mana Potions in between. Because many of the bosses have a long wake-up period where you have time to set up, this playstyle is extremely potent. If you have time, pump up your Sigil of Power stacks by spamming either Spark or Arc, whichever you do not have Inspiration on. For certain bosses where you are extremely confident in your damage output, you can take this a step further by running a 100% crit build. In this build, you use Excise and Ambush as supports. Aim for 50% critical hit rate in the tooltip, as Ambush gives 100% more crit when the enemy is on full life. If you have over 62.5%, you can take super critical for some more crit damage. Otherwise, if you have between 40 to 50, inevitable critical can get you to the 50. This should only be used on bosses where you have time to set up on, or bosses with sufficient energy shield to tank 2 lightning orbs. Skip Orb of Storms in this opener if needed. Compared to the other builds, the Shocked Ground Conduit spam version has the strongest potential, but requires setup. In extended encounters, it can be cumbersome and dangerous to set up the Shocked Ground. The next playstyle uses Orb of Storms and Arc to proc Shock. Compared to the previous build, this build can function entirely from range, and have more consistent performance. Because Ball Lightning is not required in this build at all, it can be dropped for an off-element spell, such as Cold Snap or Ember Fusillade, which are both quick casts that could give an extra stack of Rising Tempest for 12% more damage. Run your debuffing supports on Orb of Storms. Lightning Exposure, Strip Away, Overcharge, and Conduction. Make sure to slot Inspiration on Arc for this build for the reduced mana cost. For a more hands-off approach, Conduit can be put on Cast on Shock in order to automatically trigger the burst when hitting shocks. Conduit has a long cast time and requires you to stand still, so this build is exceptionally more mobile, safe, and brain off, though the damage potential of each burst will not be as high due to having less supports available. On Cast on Shock, you will want Lightning Conduit, Impetus, Considered Casting, Elemental Focus, and Lightning Mastery. Next, we'll look at the passive tree and break down the options. First, we'll start out with the Ascension tree. The 2 nodes for Arcane Surge are extremely powerful, giving a permanent Arcane Surge that scales with your mana for tons of multiplicative cast speed and mana regen. Strike Twice is the next priority. While this is a very powerful node, early game you won't have that much shock magnitude yet, so get the Arcane Surge nodes first. Scouring Winds amps up our exposure debuff, making our burst setup that much more powerful. Now onto the main skill tree. We'll start out with the core early game pathing. Start out with raw power in the Path of Storm. Later in the game, we'll path towards critical overload and open mind. But early on, the increased damage here is very substantial. The next major node to path to is straight up, to all 3 notables here: Electric Amplification, Power Conduction, and Pure Power. These are all crucial nodes in the final build, granting increased magnitude on exposure, shock, and lightning damage. The next priority is getting Lightning Quick, which grants a total of 20% cast speed, on top of giving increased lightning damage. From here, path to Eldritch Battery, Arcane Intensity, and Raw Mana. These nodes around Eldritch Battery are insanely high value with their mana stacking, giving us spell damage per mana and increased maximum mana to scale Archmage. Ether Flow is an option for some builds, but will reduce mana regen while casting Conduit, making it situational at best. Now let's look at a fleshed out endgame build. At the end of the early game, will be quite squishy. Mind over Matter is the one-stop solution to this, diverting all damage to go to mana before life, at the hefty cost of cutting our mana regen in half. As such, you'll need to play much slower to compensate until you can stack enough mana regen and DPS to play normally, or just avoid the straight path then. When not running Mind over Matter, Adverse Growth and Lucidity can be taken, which grants a total of 24% damage from mana before life without penalizing mana regeneration. Chaos Inoculation is also an option for those running Mind over Matter, giving Chaos immunity at the cost of all health. Life can add an extra layer of protection as well as offensive capability through Life Tap, so I prefer not to use it personally. The other late game focus is maxing out our Shock Magnitude. To reach the cap, we'll be prioritizing Jewel Songs, while padding to some very strong notables along the way. Wild Storm is a powerful pickup that gives a multiplicative increase on maximum lightning damage, making it a very high value node. Endless Circuit, which is right next to it, gives a chance to reapply Shock, which is not mandatory at all, but can be a nice quality of life, especially if not running a Shocked Ground build. Exposed to the Storm is not recommended, as 30% conditional crit is not worth 3 points. The only other thing you get with it is Resistance Pen, which is nigh useless because we're already debuffing resistance far below 0%, and penetration does nothing beyond that point. And next, we'll go all the way down to Frazzled, which grants a total of 75% shock magnitude for the branch. Flush out the build with Overexposure and Breaking Point, for 30% magnitude on both exposure and shock. All natural is also a nice node to grab. The damage increases are worthwhile, and you get a bit of extra resistance to make gearing easier. This is what the final build looks like, requiring level 87. Options for additional points include Touch the Arcane, Desensitization, Alternating Current, or more jewel sockets. Speaking of jewels, at this point we'll have a total of 8 jewel sockets with the base build, and 130% shock magnitude. Because our primary shock support has 75% from overcharge, this means we need a further 195% to reach the 400% magnitude required to cap shock, making the magnitude per jewel requirement 24% on average, or 22% with a 9th jewel socket. Shock magnitude is the most important jewel stat by far. Here's a small graph showing the expected DPS gain of various jewels with a fleshed out build with average stats. Shock magnitude eclipses all of the other values when looking at conduit DPS, but even with the value of Shock's damage amplification by itself, the value of a max Shock line is the best damage option, until you are right next to cap, where the gain is diluted enough for critical damage to be a higher value. But crit damage and spell crit damage, which is a separate line, are both suffixes, so you could get them alongside amplification anyway. In the next section, we'll talk about gearing. The ideal weapon combo includes a wand and focus, as this allows us to get a larger amount of offensive substats. However, the most important line by a mile is plus level, which rolls the same on staff that it does on a wand and focus combo. As such, getting a standout staff is a perfectly viable alternative to wand/focus if you aren't gunning for the absolute best in slot. Though speaking of staff, we will want a Chiming staff on our weapon swap for Sigil of Power, which gives a massive spell damage amp. The stats on this don't matter, aside from the level on spells, which increases both the duration and spell damage per stack. In terms of weapon stats, here's a chart of stats and their estimated increases to our DPS on an average build. As you can see, the level of the spells is the most potent increase by a long shot. Note that plus level to lightning spells maxes out at 1 higher level than spell skills, at 5 rather than 4. With these values in mind, assuming all maximum rolls, here are the priorities in order for a best in slot. Plus 5 to lightning, spell damage, lightning damage, cast speed, critical hit chance, and then hybrid spell damage and mana. For your focus, the ideal lines are similar. Spell level, spell damage, lightning damage, cast speed, critical hit chance, and then flat mana. Foci do not have the same spell damage and mana hybrid line, so flat mana is preferred. Next, the Amulet. We have a decent survivability option here with Azure Gaze, which grants extra maximum energy shield based on mana. This applies after Eldritch Battery, allowing us to have energy shield that we wouldn't normally be allowed to have, but grants little offensive capability. In terms of standard amulets, Azure Amulet is the most stat efficient, giving us almost a half a roll of mana regen as an implicit line. The preferred lines are plus 3 spell, percent maximum mana, flat mana, and cast speed. The remaining slots can go to elemental resistance, attributes, or spirit as needed. For Anoint options, Lightning Rod is a powerful choice, making our non-crits lucky, which equates to an average of 16.67 increase for non-crit. However, this is extremely expensive to distill. A budget option is Conservative Casting, which gives mana regen and reduced mana cost of skills. Or, for those not running Mind Over Matter, Mentor Perseverance is a nice 10% mana before life mitigation. Rings are a very important and highly scaling part of this build. For unique options, Dream Fragments is undoubtedly best in slot, giving a 20% max mana boost on top of mana regen and cold resist. To top it all off, it gives immunity to chill and freeze. This is a very expensive option, however. It's recommended to run a Breach Ring due to the 50% quality cap allowing you to get insanely high mana values. The recommended stats for maximizing DPS are, in order, maximum mana, cast speed, mana regen, and then lightning damage. Don't forget to prioritize getting the resistance you need to cap though. Belt has a very powerful unique with Ingenuity, which amplifies the gain from rings by up to 80% without corruption. This is the most powerful option by far, as belts do not have any offensive lines they could roll outside of mana. In terms of normal belts, it's recommended to use a utility belt, as the instant flask recovery effect can be very clutch in many situations. For substats, prioritize mana, life, resistances, and optionally, charm slots for utility. Armor priorities are similar: mana, life, intelligence, and resistances, with the following priorities on certain items. On helmet, prioritize critical chance as a suffix. On body armor, prioritize spirit, as well as a percent increased energy shield line for more mana conversion, as this has a high value on body armor only. Movement speed on boots is a must, and critical damage is nice to get on gloves. And that wraps up this deep dive. Check out the description for the full-length text version of this guide, which I will be updating constantly as the meta shifts and some things get inevitably nerfed. See you guys next time. Bye bye!